My dear friends, it has been a terrible week here in Los Angeles, and I do hope you and yours are staying safe and well. I'm on the UCLA campus today, where there's an eerie sense of quiet as most of our students and colleagues have left to seek refuge with their families. On behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I want to extend my deepest sympathies to those who've lost homes, schools, and sacred spaces, and for all of us grieving the loss of our beloved canyons and landmarks and the damage done to our communities. I pray for the amazing firefighters and first responders and volunteers who are working so hard to protect us, and that these winds will pass and the fires will be extinguished so we can begin our recovery together soon. My name is Caroline Luce, and I am a project director at the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment and Levy Center affiliated faculty. And it is my honor to welcome today's featured speaker, Sandra Fox. Sandra Fox is the Goldstein-Goren Visiting Assistant Professor of American Jewish History at New York University and Director of the Archive of the American Jewish Left in the Digital Age. Her research interests include American Jewish history, the history of youth and childhood, Yiddish culture, and the history of sexuality. She's also the producer of an amazing show called Weibertisch, a feminist podcast for Yiddish speakers and the Yiddish curious, which I highly recommend. Sandy and I will be discussing her amazing book today, The Jews of Summer, Summer Camp and Jewish Culture in Postwar America from the Stanford University Press, as part of the Levy Center's program in American Jewish Studies. This book truly is a delight to read. It addresses the experiences of youth in post-war Jewish summer camps and the place of intergenerational negotiation in the making of American Jewish culture. Sandy, I just called you Shandy. Sandy and I share an interest in Yiddish and Yiddish education. So we've decided instead of a formal book talk, I'm going to ask her some questions and we're going to talk together about her incredible work. My hope today is that our discussion might take your mind off things for a moment and take you back to better times of summer spent in beautiful places with good friends and good times. So, Sandy, I thought we'd start by just giving you an opportunity to tell us about how this project came together. You know, one of the things I think you've done really artfully in this book is to weave together the histories of institutions that are ostensibly ideologically at odds. So instead of organizing chapters as a kind of typology of the various forms of summer camp, you found these lovely crosscuts. I loved the second chapter, for example, about the clock and how similar the daily schedule was at these camps. There's chapters on the role of games and play and language and summer flings. So can you tell us a bit about where this project began and why you've chosen to construct the narrative this way?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. Actually, when I began thinking about originally this was my dissertation research, and when I began thinking about what I might want my dissertation to be about, I was kind of looking at a bunch of different topics that had to do with youth and childhood. I've had kind of a longstanding interest in the lived experiences of young people in American Jewish history and in other contexts. And I was looking at things like Jewish youth movements. Um, and I was avoiding summer camp because I had a personal connection to it. So a lot of people think I did it because I have a personal connection to it. Actually, it was my personal connection that made me wary of doing it, and took me some time to admit to myself that I did want to study the subject. So I was wary because I had this personal connection. I had gone to a Zionist summer camp as a camper from age 9 and worked there. I think my last year I was 22, so really like right before I started graduate school. It was very fresh. Um, and so I was avoiding it. And then eventually I realized that everything I was interested in, the ways in which youth and adults negotiate power and the creation of culture, Jewish education, kind of immersive spaces that are outside the home and outside the school. There's nothing quite like camp that is sort of like sits at the nexus of all of those things. And I think it just took a little bit of time for me to feel more distance from my own experience. And the fact that this is not a book about when I went to camp. This is a book about a period I wasn't even alive for.
Right.
So that also helped me kind of get the critical distance. And then I was able to use my camp experience to understand things like the clock. You know, I did draw that from archival sources, but I also had an inherent understanding for kind of the total institution aspect of camp life, the fact that it is like a 24/7 experience with very little break, and how that also is a emotional experience, an affective experience to just kind of be in that immersion all the time. So it came through a process of avoiding and then kind of coming to acceptance that that was the topic that I really wanted to study. And what it turned out to be was, I think at first I wasn't sure if it was going to be like the entire 20th century or if it would be focused on a different period. But as I looked at archival sources, and also some of the secondary research that was already out there about summer camp, I realized that the post-war period was a very unique time. That in the wake of the Holocaust, and as Jews are becoming more upwardly mobile, they're moving to suburbs. That was a time where summer camp became more educational, more ideological, and just more geared towards taking the kind of like assimilated American Jewish suburban kid and giving them an experience in authentic Jewishness, whatever kind of authentic Jewishness the camp believed it was giving. There were Zionist summer camps that based their visions of authenticity on Palestine and later Israel. There were Yiddishist summer camps that looked towards Eastern Europe or the Yiddish speaking kind of Lower East Side idea. And there were the Reform and Conservative summer camps that drew from different kinds of places, but ultimately, we're also trying to create a kind of new, involved lay leader and kind of an ideal conservative or Reform Jew. And what you mentioned, right, is that I could have probably written this book about one of those types of camps. And there are several good books that only look at one camp or look at one type of camp. But by looking at the archives of all these different camps, I realized that they were so similar despite their ideological differences, and that the meat, as it were, was really in what they had in common,
Mhm.
and also like how they could use the format of camp, the daily schedules, different kinds of games, Tisha B'Av, which is the only Jewish holy day of the in the summertime, and it's a day of mourning, um, democracy, sexuality, all sorts of things, how they could use those to get campers interested in their ideological frameworks. So different ideologies, which would have definitely butt heads in other contexts. Um, but within the world of summer camping, they were doing really similar things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Um, I thought maybe we could talk there about that archive that you were able to build. One of the moments it was very relatable to me was what you did in the clock chapter in terms of organizing the data you'd collected in that comparative way of like tracking that. That is exactly the kind of itch I would have scratched myself looking at these archives. So let's talk a little bit about sort of where you bring the narrative together. I mean, on the one hand, I was really struck by how intimate your narrative feels. And I gather that's in part because of the source material. You clearly have some informants here, right? Sharing personal stories. Sometimes they're named. I imagine there's many who are not.
Mhm.
Um, but of course, when people talk about their childhoods, and maybe this is kind of what you were describing about your own distance from your own camping experience, it's really tricky to avoid drifting into nostalgia. I mean, my own work on Boyle Heights, for example, it's very difficult to talk to people about their good old days in a neighborhood in ways that aren't colored by a sense of longing, a sense of loss in some ways. So childhood in particular is a really tough one to get kind of what I would say honest reflections on that aren't sort of through those sepia toned lenses. Um, how did you kind of avoid that? How did you navigate that when you were conducting oral histories and building a narrative that kept some distance but also felt so intimate?
It's funny because now I do oral history as part of my job with the Archive of the American Jewish Left and the Digital Age. But actually, there was a version of this book, an entire version of this book that I submitted to a publisher without any oral history or without much.
Wow.
Um, And I think that that's how, in the final version, I didn't really let the rose-colored lenses or the nostalgia infect too much. Although there have been some criticisms that it's there anyway, and I find that interesting because I really don't, I don't see it. But but I think people who, I think people do also come with their own nostalgia, and then they find nostalgia in the book, which is very
Right,
understandable.
right.
But I think that that's sort of like, I did have informants, and eventually I did do oral history with about 40 different former campers, which is a lot and also not a lot. Like
Mhm.
40 people representing all the different kinds of summer camps across decades. And I wanted to get some who were LGBTQ ultimately, not none of them were out at camp in this time, and some who weren't, and gender divides. Ultimately, that was a very small subsection.
Yeah.
Um, and I can talk more about oral history, but what I would say, the thing that maybe you're sensing about the intimacy is something that I drew on from the history of childhood and youth, like the
Right.
field that kind of I'm a field I'm very involved in, outside of Jewish studies, in which it's very normal to use kind of emphatic inference, basically like everyday mind reading, when you're
Mhm.
doing your research and your writing, in order to understand what a child or young person might have felt in a
Mhm.
given place or time. The archives have voices of children and teenagers in them, but not as much as they have the voices of the adults who tried to shape them. And so I think the intimacy maybe you sensed is my kind of efforts to put myself in the place of a child or a teenager at camp and try to bring out their voices despite the kind of archival shortfalls, which is that is a common practice in sort of trying to write the history of childhood and youth, is that your voices are not going to be there all that much, even
Mhm.
if I would say in comparison to other subjects, summer camp actually has a lot of sources from children and teenagers, but still, compared to everything else, not that much. So, I would say that like the structure of the book, right? I could have the book basically has, it has seven, 8 chapters, sorry, 7 thematic chapters and one kind of epilogue chapter at the end. And the thematic chapters, there's the first half, which is basically largely about how summer camp leaders designed camp to
Mhm.
give to kind of work to give their campers their ideologies and to make them into better or more real or authentic Jews. And then the last couple chapters are much more about the intergenerational tension, negotiations between young people and their elders at camp. And by elders, I mean everything from counselors who are not that much older to senior staff to rabbis. There's a lot of different ages at a camp. Um, and in those chapters, I really had to both dig into the archives to find any kind of example of what campers really thought about what was going on. I had to use the oral histories, and then I also had to use kind of the skill of just how would if I were a teenager and I were kind of in this place, what would I feel? What would I be thinking about? What would my experience be? And, on the one hand, that's a hard thing to do, and it's not straightforward, and it's something that I think some people might find to be kind of like dubious from a scholarly perspective, but it
Mhm.
is what needs to be done when you're looking at children and youth. I would say, like the language chapter, for instance, I could have written something much drier about the ways that camps taught Hebrew and Yiddish,
Yeah.
their struggles with it. But then I thought, well, if I were a camper who didn't speak a lick of Hebrew or Yiddish back at home, and then they tried to make me speak Hebrew or Yiddish, what would I do? Would I
Mhm.
be good with it? Not so
Mhm.
much. And then I found sources that did kind of speak to that. So it's a delicate dance, and it's something that like it took a long time to hone. But I'm really happy I did it, and I hope I get to do future work on history of American Jewish youth where I get to use that skill, because it's definitely a lacuna in the field. Let's just put it that way. Kind of like we hear a lot about Jewish education. We hear a lot about the anxieties that Jewish adults have around children and young people. We don't really understand how children and young people have lived in American Jewish history. There's still so much to know.
Totally. I mean, I think I guess I could understand some scholarly skepticism, but I could also see a lot of scholarly resonance. We are teachers when it comes down to it, or at least those of us who care about our students are. And that struggle of a sense of powerlessness over them versus the kind of school marm instinct that kicks in about, oh, well, maybe if I just do this, I can change the outcome. Maybe if I just do this, I can control. And I think, at least with college age students, one has to assume, or at least I hope my colleagues assume, that they are working, that they have various care responsibilities, family responsibilities, obligations, commitments, so that they're not sort of entirely yours in that way or captive in that way. But I imagine it's much harder for the individuals involved to be as humble about their influence when it is younger children that they are responsible for, as you say, 24 hours a day, right? They don't go
Yeah.
home. You're in loco parentis, as my boarding school used to tell us all the time. But it
But they
actually,
also, but
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
they also did, in a way, they actually admitted that problem all the time. There were
Mm,
a lot of Jewish educators who said, like, we're gonna do what we're gonna try to do this, we're gonna try to turn them into this kind of Jew. But at the end of the day, they have to, it's kind of like the, what is it, bring the horse to water. You can't make
right,
them drink
right.
problem. So they were aware of it. And as part of my book really shows, they tried to get camper buy-in in all sorts of various ways in order to kind of convince them
Right,
of the broader project. So they
right.
understood the campers had power. They probably understood it more than the campers did.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking a lot when I was reading your chapters about, Paul Mishler's wonderful book Raising Reds, and the communist attitude towards youth was very particular in the sense that what he describes, they viewed them as a little proletariat in relationship to
Mhm.
the adult world, which is to say, we don't need to educate them about how the world works. They can see how the world works. They're fully autonomous, fully radicalized individuals born of their own experience. Now, they were speaking specifically of sort of poor and working class children who you might say got an education on the streets,
Mhm.
school of life, as you were. But I was always struck by however much they might say that, they still, wanted a sense of control and to socialize them and to put them into patterns of conducting their affairs that were offering a kind of structure, even as they're sort of embracing their autonomy.
Yep.
So yeah, that's really interesting to hear that you can see that kind of skepticism or I guess self-doubt like peeking through the records as a whole. Because what I was going to ask you is, there's I'm glad to hear there's space for that, but I also wonder, what kind of a critical eye you had to bring to some of these institutional sources, because of course they have to, earn their bread. They have to persuade uh, institutional powers that be, individual donors, that their work is successful, like that it's working, their model. So tell me a little bit about those sources and, how you read those and the kind of surprising things that maybe poked through in that reading.
It's funny you should say that because I never thought about it. Camping today is very much, driven by donor money,
Hmm.
by Jewish institutions that give camps money. It wasn't so much like that in the post-war
Oh, that's
period.
interesting. I didn't realize that.
A lot of camps had sponsoring organizations, but they were like the parent organizations
Right.
of youth movements or of like youth wings. And
Right.
so they didn't really need to be convinced because this was their project. So actually, there aren't a lot of sources to that effect. Um, the people they're trying to convince of the power of camp seem to be each other. So camp directors and camp staff would go to like there were a couple of big conferences that brought camp leaders together where they made speeches at each other about how important their work was. And not just that, obviously, we do this at camp X and
Right.
we do this at camp Y, sharing ideas, which is also how so many camps ended up doing similar activities and sorts of things like that. But there are some articles like in the Jewish press I found where they're trying to convince the broader public, but really it's more of an internal conversation, um, which is fascinating. It just wasn't as driven by donor uh, things, by donors at all.
Mm.
It was a cheaper enterprise at the time. Camp
Yeah,
got
so
more
tell me a little
expensive,
bit
and
about that. That's really interesting to hear. So it sounds like what you're saying is that basically the fees, the admission fees or whatever they were charging was paying for the camp at the time. That seems remarkable given how expensive everything has gotten, particularly in terms of upkeep and maintenance today. Do you see I mean, were they just more homespun in the sense like were the
Yes.
yeah. Tell
Yeah.
me about
Well,
that.
no, let me be clear. There aren't a lot of financial records in the archives. I'm just saying I haven't seen anything like letters to donors or
Right.
soliciting funds that would tell
And
you that there's a
sources.
huge donor part to this story.
Right.
Um, let's say, the Young Judea camps, those are Zionist summer camps. They were sponsored, I believe, by the WZO before Hadassah, and that
Hmm.
meant they got money from the WZO and then Hadassah. Um, the Workers' Circle camps got money from the Workers' Circle,
Right. Right.
that kind of thing. So there is money coming in that's not just money from tuition, but it's not from donors. But it was a simpler time in terms of the finances. Uh, you could run camp a lot more cheaply. One of the things that actually made running sleepaway camps more challenging was kind of like rising costs and burdens of insurance and different
Uh-huh.
things that like accrediting organizations like the American Camping Association or like health departments started to require of camps. And so I think around the 70s, 80s, running camps did get more expensive. And then you also have a recession. And that forced a lot of camps to close. But in this sort of like post-war period, golden era, it was very affordable to run camps. They bought most of these Jewish camps were bought when land was very cheap. So
Right.
like there are almost no new Jewish camps or any camps really opening at entirely new campsites. They might there are new programs that run at older
Yeah, I
campsites and
see like
stuff
they
like that,
buy
but
out and all. Yeah.
yeah, land's already not cheap in any place where it would be simple to send kids for the summer. But there are stories of camps in upstate New York that were bought for $20, like, acres and acres of land.
Wow.
So it was affordable to start a camp. It was pretty affordable to run a camp. Parents did not have the same kind of expectations of like the facilities or the quality of food, so everything's just gotten or camps today have a lot of trips that cost a lot of money. You got to rent buses. You got to just camps were so much simpler. So
Yeah.
it was much more affordable. There were scholarships still for Jewish kids. It wasn't that all families could afford to send kids to camp without help. So there was assistance. But these particular kinds of camps were not fancy.
Mhm. Yeah, actually, you're making me think of a question that we haven't really discussed, but I thought I might let you speak to a little bit, which is this kind of chronological arc that you're setting up here, this contrast you make to sort of previous modes of camping.
Mhm.
It's another place that my interests intersect with this project because I have spent a lot of time studying tuberculosis and treatment patterns for tuberculosis. And this sort of sanatorium movement, was one part about progression of medical science in terms of understanding that it was a bacteria that caused tuberculosis, yada, yada, yada. Um, on the other hand, it was also about this kind of moment in terms of people's relationships to city and to nature. And this almost romanticization of the kind of restorative power of nature. Los Angeles was very much regarded as a haven for nature's great sanatorium, as they used to describe, for our clean air and our clean water, if you can believe that. Um, so can you talk a little bit, I don't want to pull us too far off track here, but you just kind of gestured at it, which is to say, um, the origin points for some of these camps sort of precede this kind of baby boom golden age era you're discussing about. Can you talk a little bit about how the kind of animating impulses of those early camping efforts might have differed from really what the main thrust of what you're documenting here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm often asked if American Jews go to camp more than other Americans. And the
Mm-hmm.
answer is actually no. Apparently, Mormons go to camp in much higher numbers than American Jews. Like an incredible percentage of Mormons go to camp. But American Jews do go to camp differently than most other Americans. They or historically have actually. That's all changing now. And we can talk about that. But historically, they've gone to camp for longer sessions to places that, it's like the same campsite year after year, because the camps own those sites. They might go for 4 to 8 weeks. So they develop a very long and intense relationship often with Jewish summer camps. Um, Whereas, let's say, church camps and other kinds of camps ran by like Christian denominations, those are usually a weekend long or a
Yeah,
week
they're more like
long, and maybe you go,
retreats, right? Like a
yeah,
week. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. And so the Jewish mode of camping came out of the broader kind of Northeastern mode of camping. It wasn't just Jews who camped that way, it was also Protestants. So in kind of wealthier, in the turn of the century, wealthier camps were ran by Protestants, and Jews were not welcome into those camps, and thus developed a separate Jewish camping sector. And at the same time, all of this came out of basically a response to urbanization and industrialization. And like you're saying, escaping the city and how that's like inherently healthier for children. Um, and so Jews who were living in big cities like New York, Chicago, are really like living in the epicenter of that kind of progressive era reformer movement. And camps came out of that. So um, in those early days at the turn of the century, uh, you had the building of summer camps for Jewish immigrants, separate camps for the most part because there were, implicit ways that Jews were not welcome, usually implicit, to summer camps ran by Christians. So that's kind of where that came from. And then in the post-war era, what happened is that Jewish camps became kind of increasingly Jewish in terms of the kinds of programs they ran. And that was in response to really the social comfort that they're starting to feel in America, and the fact that Jewish educators wanted them to go to camp to learn how to be Jewish. Before that, before the Holocaust and kind of post-war Jewish exodus to suburbia, there were Jewish summer camps that were educational, definitely, and I talk about that, but it exploded really in that post-war era. And that's where you get like the big camps that we know of, Camp Ramah, the URJ camps, which weren't URJ back then, but the Reform Movement camps. That's when they kind of join into this movement. And even the camps that existed before, like Yiddish summer camps, they became more Yiddishist. They became more interested in the project of continuing Yiddish culture because you can imagine that in the pre-war era, um, these are the children of immigrants, so they have familiarity at the very least with Yiddish, if not fluency. Um, their parents are reading Yiddish newspapers, listening to Yiddish radio at home. It didn't feel um, urgent. It didn't feel like camp had to save a culture. And in the post-war era, Yiddish camps came to see themselves as saving a culture. So, you know, the concept of this sort of like American Jewish summer camp did definitely start pre-Holocaust, kind of pre Second World War, but its use changed so dramatically. It was no longer about going into nature, and much more about finding one's Jewish identity. And these are not, then they kind of evolved to being not particularly geared towards hiking or sports or camping, right? Like that's not they do those things to some extent, but it's not the thrust of what they're doing.
Yeah, one of the tropes I've seen in some of the literature about camping culture is about sort of war games and restorative survival stuff, right? The way that camps kind of pantomime the Western experience of being on the frontier and survival skills and restoring masculinity. I don't see a lot of that happening here, although I'm sure there are elaborate sort of capture the flaggy kind of things
Yes.
in terms of the games they're playing.
Yeah, and there is some stuff of masculinity, but it's very different masculinity. And a
Yeah.
lot of times it was based on like notions of Israelis being kind of more masculine, more in touch with their bodies. So that's a whole other thing.
Yeah, well, but let's continue on this gender path because, when you talk about sort of communal regeneration and survival, the chapter on, sexual dalliances is particularly in here. I will say it resonated for me, even as a non-camp goer and a non-Jew, that the folks I know who went to camp were always these informants about what first base was and what site. They
Hmm.
always came back from camp with these discoveries that were then shared. And so a huge part of my sort of socialization when it came to sex came via Jewish camp indirectly. Um, but it sort of hits at this point you were saying before about this kind of intergenerational, autonomy versus, I don't know. Tell me a little bit about that. I mean, I was struck by the fact that some of these camps are, for all intents and purposes, encouraging the campers to hook up and mess around with each other, whereas others are a little bit more anxious about it in this kind of reactionary sexual revolution kind of way. Tell me a little bit about, what sex and gender in that chapter on, I forget what it's called, Summer Flings, how it sits in some of these themes that you've been talking about before.
Yeah. I mean, well, if I didn't think I was going to write about camp at all, I definitely didn't think I was going to write about sex at camp. And what changed that? No, because also I will say, it's changed a lot because I'm older and, have something of reputation now. But when I was a graduate student and I was trying to convince people that the history of youth and childhood mattered, it was hard, first of all. And then it was going to be even harder if I wrote about hookup culture.
Mm-hmm.
What changed all that was Me Too. And specifically, there were a lot of articles in the Jewish press written by former campers, recent former campers too, young women, about the sexual culture at their summer camps,
Mm-hmm.
which they were talking about in terms of rape culture,
Mm-hmm.
and the pressure they felt to be sexual and romantic at camp, as part of the American Jewish community's obsession with curbing intermarriage. So
Mm-hmm.
that's when I started to say, okay, I had been collecting snippets about sex and romance at camp because I loved it and it was so funny to me. And I was kind of writing like a blog for my friends that I didn't advertise anywhere with that stuff because I just loved it and wanted to make sure I kept it somewhere. And then I realized that it was that there was a story there and that it did deserve scholarly treatment. And basically, the story there is that, camps long, kind of even before the post-war period, way before there were fears about intermarriage, camps were happy to encourage or foster kind of romantic moods and thought of it as really a nice part, normal part of adolescence for kids to meet each other at camp. And people got married younger too, right? Let's remember, like if you went to camp in your preteens or even your teen teens, which they did, or you were a counselor, that could be the person you marry. That's not
Right.
how it is now, almost ever. But like back then, there were a lot of marriages out of summer camps because people got married younger. Um, What's interesting is that during and after the sexual revolution, camps have to now worry about the possibility that campers won't just kind of engage in what they thought of as age appropriate sexual behavior. There's a risk that they might actually have sex, there might be pregnancies. Um, and so you would think that they would try to curb like to kind of stop kids from having time to get involved in sexual experiences. There were examples in the archive of how staff members kind of debated this, like what is acceptable sexual behavior? How do we protect, not really protect, they didn't say protect
I was
campers.
going to
They
say
did
no
care.
campaigns to have condoms at camp, I'm sure.
No, not like that. No, I don't mean that kind of protection. I guess I meant social protection. They wanted to make sure that campers who weren't ready to date didn't feel like they had to. So, like, there were examples at one Camp Ramah where they did give campers a period of time after the last activity of the day, so like 9 p.m., to go hook up. That was what it was. Like, they would have a half hour to get back to the bunk, and camps still had that in my time. I don't actually think so much right now. I don't know, but I would imagine a lot of that's been stopped. Um, and they wanted to make sure that campers who weren't ready had somewhere to go, so they'd like turn the light on at the basketball court, stuff like that. So there was an awareness. Um, but what's really interesting is that by and large, even with some concern that campers could go too far sexually, for the most part, they weren't overly concerned with that. And they wanted campers to have those opportunities at camp. And they wanted it for two reasons. One is to make sure that they're having, like a experience that will encourage them to do Jewish dating as their path later on. Um, so if they form these relationships at camp, it might form a kind of habit, a preference around dating Jewish. But I would say over and above that in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, it's really about, you have these camps, they're highly ideological atmospheres, right? And despite their efforts to make campers feel involved in the planning of camp life, it's pretty structured. And campers, especially teenagers who are going to get involved in sexuality, often would push back and say I don't have freedom here, they didn't often push back on the ideologies, but they'd push back in other ways. They would be upset if they didn't have like the right to enter the bunk of someone of the opposite sex, or they wanted more free time. Or there's one great example from one camp in California, actually, where the campers rallied behind the idea that they should be allowed to use curse words. Um, it's funny because it was just like that was a rule. They couldn't curse and they wanted to curse. So they're having this debate with their counselors and they're trying to if this camp is democratic, then why can't we use whatever words we want? Very smart, right? Intelligent kids. And camp leaders talk about if we give them the freedom in this arena, right? We know they come to camp wanting to have romantic and sexual encounters. Let's give them freedom in that arena. They'll love camp and they'll buy in to what we're selling. That sounds really nefarious. And it
No,
sounds really like intentional. And it's like it was sort of I think it was a little bit intentional, but it was more like here's an accidental byproduct of what's already happening. And
right,
instead of stopping what's happening, let's figure out how to use it. So
right.
I really am trying to be careful about not making it sound like there was some sort of master plan. There wasn't. These
It
were
speaks to
people
that
who were just like doing their
negotiation.
best.
It
Yeah.
speaks to that negotiation you're talking about because I think, um, again, I don't mean to privilege my own experience, but like we want our students to like us, right? And we want them to buy in. And so many of the calculations we make in our classrooms are about, how far can I push them before they turn on me, if you will, right? So it is, as you say, a way to recover the agency of the campers, even sort of indirectly, is through the way that um, counselors, camp administrators understood very well that that it was a give and take, that they were going to have to sort of give them something, some kind of accommodation. Otherwise, they would lose them and they would never come back. And then the camp might collapse, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say this is where that emphatic inference, the kind of everyday mind reading, and mixed with my own experience of going to camp was helpful because um, I remembered this friend of mine. I was just like hook, line, and sinker into summer camp and into going to activities and really not that rebellious. But I had this one friend who had a lot more freedom. Like, not really, actually. I had a lot of freedom as a kid, but she had a different kind of freedom. And she was also less interested in the Jewish programming. And she encouraged me to skip some educational activity to go shave our legs in an empty bunk. And then we got in trouble. And she was so angry. She's like, we're teenagers and they treat us like we're children. And I was like, that's a good point. We are teenagers. And at home, I do, all this stuff by myself. I take the train to Manhattan. And suddenly here I am being kind of treated like a baby. But then in that hour or 45 minutes between the last activity of the day and going back to the bunk, suddenly you are given full reign in the
Yeah, and it's
dark.
dark. Yeah.
It's kind of crazy. It's like during the day, they're like, you have to be here and here and here. And yeah, you can't go shave your legs in an empty bunk their reason was because you need supervision. But then at night, there's basically no supervision in lots of parts of the camp. So it was, I wasn't writing about my experience, and I want to be clear about that. But my experience helped me be able to understand the experience of others.
Yeah, totally. Um, Maybe this is an aside, but because it's not central in the book, but it pops through in a couple of places. Can we talk about this kind of register of the counselor, right?
Yeah.
Because they do sort of move in between. I say this just because my bestie was a CIT, as they used to call it, and then a counselor at her camp she went to in childhood, Camp Tawanga, God bless it. Um, how do you see their, in this rubric of kind of autonomy, how do you see them kind of moving between camper and administrator? And are there any, anecdotes or examples of moments where the counselors exert the same kind of agency that you're describing of your friend and, push back against the administrators in their own right?
Yeah, it's a funny dynamic because to the camper, the counselor is an adult. And
Right,
then to the senior staff, the counselor is a child.
right, right.
And there was this notion, and there still is in American Jewish education, actually. I've heard this from educators today, that camp is for the counselors, meaning the impactful experience is at the counselor age, which means they're basically thought of as campers. So it's a hard thing to parse out as a writer. And the biggest challenge for me was that in the archives, there are programs and letters and all sorts of things not attributed to anyone. I don't know if that person who wrote that camp program was 15, 18, 25, 40. I don't know. So that is it's a tricky category to write about.
Mhm.
But I did my best, and I thought I did find, examples of campers talking about their counselors as role models. Of course, there were also camper counselor relationships in the case where you have like young teenage campers with
Right,
older teenage staff. That was
right.
very common. I mean, honestly, it even happened when I went to camp in the early 2000s, like late 90s, early 2000s. It's probably been rooted out more now, or at least mostly, but it was super common back then. So the whole category of youth at camp is complicated because you have two different categories of young people and they're not the same. But to the senior staff, there are similar dynamics at play. You want to make sure the counselors are having a good time so that they stay. You need to hire counselors. It's hard. It was really hard back then to hire counselors. I think I'm sure it's still hard now for different reasons. But in a context in which, young American Jews are going to college and their families have money. Like the amount of money a camp could offer a counselor was a joke in terms of payment. So it was pretty hard to hire people,
Mhm.
and to hire the right people. And so camps have to keep campers happy and they also have to keep counselors happy so they have counselors.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know if I answered your question, but it's an
No, no,
interesting
no.
dynamic and a hard one to write about because the counselors are a little silent in the
It
archives, even more
resonates.
silent maybe than campers.
It resonates a lot because just in the landscape of Yiddish education here, there's this big effort in the 30s where all these folks at what was a very fledgling institution then, but is now called the Bureau of Jewish Education, are kind of freaking out about those older teenagers. So they
Right.
actually started a what they call a Mittelschule here in LA, and there's all these articles about like exactly what you just said. Like those are the key. That's the key age
Hmm.
to get them. Like all this stuff with the little kids is really well, but we're failing when it comes to the teenagers. The teenagers are the ones. This is the key. And they attempt to start, and I will say, as far as I remember, basically fail to get this middle school in a place where it can endure,
Mm.
um, part because of exactly the kind of moments that you were describing with your friend, where these teenagers all of a sudden become self-aware about their own ability to make choices about their lives. And much to the dismay of their Yiddish speaking parents, going after school to learn Yiddish and sing Yiddish songs is not top of their list.
Yep.
So I can imagine that as both historical subjects and as would-be employees, it's a very similar struggle to maintain that interest and get people really locked in that way.
Yeah, and add to that the challenge that different camps had different ages that they considered to be campers and counselors.
Right,
So
right.
Zionist summer camps tended to keep campers as campers into high school,
Hmm.
because they were involved in Jewish youth movements. That was kind of the idea was like at camp you got leadership skills as campers, and then you could bring that back to the movement. And their counselors were maybe 2 years older than them.
Wow.
Um, Whereas at other camps, it ended, let's say, around 13. And then you have a true age gap with the counselors who are 17, 18, 19. Um, and then at a place like Ramah or the Reform Summer Camps, they also have professional Jewish educators and rabbis on staff. Whereas at Zionist summer camps, the camp director was 25. So then you're just talking about a camp that's just like entirely young people, but still, obviously, there's a difference between 8, 13, and 18 and 25. So that is something that was very hard to write about, actually.
Yeah, I
I'm glad
love
you
it
brought it
about
up.
American Summer, how they're all the same age and they're trying to
Yeah.
make them different. It's pretty adorable. But what you've just gestured at, I think, gets to one of my kind of main questions emerging from this book. And it's really about, you know, the differences between the project of Jewish camps and the project of Jewish education broadly, right? As you've been describing, you know, some of these camps and some of the people who ran these camps are essentially engaged in the full-time year-round work of Jewish education, and camps are kind of an extension of that educational mission. They're
Mhm.
often schools, say in cities, that are feeding the summer camp and populating them that way. In other cases, it's really just a camp, right? That's all they do. It's something different. They regard it as something different. So I wondered if we could talk about that a little bit. I mean, as you've gotten sort of into this work, you know, are you seeing camps as some kind of distinct? I mean, is it just the setting? Is it that they're away? Is it that the parents are gone? Or are these, in fact, fully integrated with a broader program of Jewish education that was designed to be part of your year-round life? I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit.
Mm.
Maybe there's
It
types
just
that are different.
depends.
Yeah, different.
Yeah, it just depends. So the Zionist summer camps, like I said, a lot of them were connected to youth movements. And then there was a lot of thinking about those things as interconnected. Like what happened at camp was a training ground for what should happen during the year. Um, Yiddish summer camps started as a place for the children of Yiddish day schools to go in the summertime. But then as those day schools started to die out and fewer children are going to the ones that still existed, they become separate things on their own, right? Like places where they get Yiddish culture and access to Yiddish language where they kind of otherwise might not have. Or maybe they'd have an afternoon experience once a week in the city, but not much. So it really depends, is the answer. But I do think that no matter the situation, Jewish educators did think of camp as essentially different because it was a kind of 24/7 immersive experience. And even if they were involved in other things during the year, I found loads and loads of evidence that they did not think those things were nearly as effective or important as what happened at camp. And
That's
other
interesting.
evidence of kind of the separateness of it, the conservative summer camps, for instance, pushed the conservative movement in a bunch of different ways. They were more feminist and egalitarian than the conservative movement was at the time. And the things that happened at camps, the kind of innovations of getting women involved, young girls and women involved in leading the service, eventually came into the synagogue. So there were things going on at even the camps of larger movements that were different than what was happening back at home. Reform and not less of the reform, sorry, conservative summer camps, the Ramah camps, also fostered a big air of criticism of the conservative movement and the conservative synagogue. They prayed differently and they bemoaned that their synagogues back at home were not kind of as, I guess the word traditional is sort of complicated, but they did things differently and they did things inauthentically. So even when there were connections to kind of broader year-round things, they were difficult connections sometimes.
That's really
And
interesting.
actually, another good example from the Yiddish camps is that Camp Boy Brick, which was a camp connected to the Shalom Aleichem Folk Institute in New York, which also had a school. Its longtime director and founder, Levish Lehrer, really believed that engaging campers in Jewish ritual like Shabbos and Tisha B'Av was really, really important for fostering Jewish identity. The secular Yiddishists back at home
I
who
was going to say, did not like
wanted
that.
nothing to do, they sent letters, they hated it. They hated it, you know? And so a great example of camp is not the same as home, even if it's the same institution that funds it or runs it. It's when you get kids away from their parents, yeah, you kind of can do whatever you want. You can try to do whatever you want.
Very
They're not
interesting.
coming home and reporting back. You know, it takes several weeks for them to do that.
Do you see Jewish camps sitting in a different place in this matrix of Jewish education today? I mean, I know for Yiddish, that's very likely true. But I don't know, maybe you could speak to that a little bit. Has there been a change in how it sits? I know here in LA, we have full-time high school, you can go to Jewish school
Hmm.
full-time every day, all day, K to 12.
That's
Um,
a great point. So I didn't mention that at the when Jews came to America, they mostly embraced public school.
mhm,
Going to any kind of Jewish school during the day, besides like afternoon or Sunday school, was very unusual. That started to change in the 60s and 70s, but still, it was a pretty small number of Jews who sent their kids to private school. It's increased. I don't remember by how much, but it's become much more common and popular. So it's true that there is kind of more interest and investment in um, day school than there was back then. But still, I think the rhetoric around camp is that it is sort of a magical, fantastical solution to all sorts of communal problems, and that it is different. And what you see as a trend in American Jewish education in the last 20 or so years with like things like birthright and other sorts of immersive Jewish experiences is trying to mimic the power of camp for in new ways, like for different ages, but also for older ages, because people do kind of like grow up later, like emerging adulthood as a category, as a thing. And so the American Jewish community is like, well, camp was effective, but then they can lose these identities by the time they are making major life decisions like how to who to marry and how to raise a family. So you see, like there's been a lot of different examples besides birthright too, Jewish retreats, service learning programs, um, where they're trying to take that power of like the group experience and the immersive experience and give it to more people and at later ages. So I would say that similar to then, there is still a notion that camp is inherently powerful and better than school.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, that definitely tracks. Well, I really appreciate these questions. I wanted to give you a chance as we sort of wind down here to really sort of take us in the new directions that this work has taken you. You know, you end the book and you've discussed some of it here with a section on what you call post-war camping, noting some of the sort of developments in more contemporary years, and you've spoken about that a bit here. I found myself wondering if, you know, there's a post-war era. I was thinking in particular about how trans and non-binary youth are changing so
Mhm.
much at the K-12 level. Certainly, you know, the politics of Israel Palestine have been shifting things around. So, you know, I just wanted to give you a space if there's anything that you're sort of noticing or tracking that we might all keep our eyes out for in the future as a development in this kind of potential, at least, new phase of where we're at. And then, of
Mhm.
course, we'll talk about your future work as well.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I don't plan on studying contemporary camping. That there are people who study it and they do it well. I would say that like what you brought up about queer and non-binary and trans campers, that was definitely a hot issue for a while. But I think it's settled into a new groove. I don't follow it that often, but you don't really hear about it anymore. It seems like camps have figured out like how to arrange bunks that account for, that care for and account for this sort of change in society, which is great. Certainly, unlike in the post-war period when none of my oral history participants who were gay and lesbian were able to be out of the closet, that's not the case now, which is wonderful. And a reflection of how far things have come in society in general. And I would say around Israel Palestine, I think one of the messages of the book that was sort of tricky, but I thought important to say, is that when you look at these broader ranges of camps at a different time, we see that there were a lot of different ways to encourage Jewish identity. And that what I've noticed is that as those decades went on and you get into like the millennial generation, it winnowed kind of to being very focused on Israel. And I think what I was trying to show is that there are other ways to do that, to give Jewish identity, that you could engage in diaspora culture and history. And it doesn't have to, I'm not saying don't do anything about Israel. Israel's a huge part of our, kind of Jewish society and the world community. But there are other things to teach and other things to know. And I still stand by that, even in the post October 7th world. I think like I recently saw a review of my book where the person said, this isn't the author's fault, but I'm sure, or I think she must feel differently about this after October 7th. I don't. I don't. I think that, like I said, Israel's important. I'm not arguing to the contrary, but I think young Jews today deserve to have more nuanced and varied Jewish identities. I think they deserve to feel proud of being diaspora Jews, which is something that, like, I personally, having grown up in the Zionist youth movement, it took me getting a PhD, like kind of pursuing a PhD in American Jewish history to understand that there's nothing to be ashamed of being an American Jew. So, and that there's a history there, right? Because I was learning the history of Zionism my whole childhood and didn't really know anything about American Jewish life. So I stand by that. And I think that, camps today have it's a hard thing. It's a really hard thing to support young people who are probably struggling to understand their place in the world at this time where the debates are really nasty and they're really hard. I do not envy them. And I know that there are a lot of really thoughtful people trying to make Israel education better at camp, trying to make it more nuanced. I think that it would surprise people like how much care there is. I think people are doing their best. So that's good.
No, I really appreciate what you're saying because I think we both share that mentality. When you interact with enough young Jews, you really start to realize how many of them are crying out
Hmm.
for alternative modes of engagement, ways to
Yep.
feel like their identities and their interests are authentic. I'm delighted to say that many of them are reaching for Yiddish. I think Yiddish is having a little bit of a moment right now for that reason. But I also, I think a lot of them are reaching for the kind of immersive experiences you're describing. As you were just talking, I thought of myself thinking there's this chicken farm. It's like a cooperative, Linka Flegel, I want to say,
Link of Legal. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
in
I've heard of that.
Massachusetts. So, I think
Hmm.
I always end my Jewish history classes on a rousing note of reminding my students just how young the folks who started these institutions were, right? Many of them were immigrants. They had just arrived in the country. They're like 20 years old. They want a form of Jewish engagement. They created it. And I think one of the things I'm hopeful about when it comes to where we go from here is these little, I hate to use fire analogies given where we're at in Southern California, but these little embers
Hmm.
of new forms of Jewish life that appear to be popping up. And however we can nurture that, again, I should stop using a fire metaphor, but however we
Yeah.
can nurture that right now, I think it's really important, and I really appreciate that.
And I
So
would say that if it's allowed and it's encouraged, I think it'll make things less black and white on the Israel issue too. Like
100%, 100%.
that's what's so funny to me about kind of the Israel centrism is not helping anything.
Well, and it speaks to this kind of dilemma that the camp directors, counselors, adults in your beautiful book here, and in the world in general feel, which is it's hard to trust that young people, if given that autonomy, are going to go in the direction that you want them
Yep.
to. But it pays so many dividends to give them that space. And it takes a lot of courage, but I have found that trusting my students, trusting their capabilities, trusting their capacities, it doesn't always work, but it really can. I mean, they can do some incredible things when you give them the support and the autonomy that they need to do them. So
Yep.
I hope we can all find that courage going forward. Sandy, before we go, I just wanted to give you an opportunity. Tell us about new work on the horizon, stuff you're working on right now, where this work is kind of headed in the future. Um, Tell me more about that.
Yeah. I'm just starting to talk about it, but I think I'm going to be, I've been working on a bunch of little projects that I've realized are actually interconnected. And I'd like to be writing a book about the history of American Jewish youth since the 1960s. So applying a lot of the lenses that I've been talking about, that I did in the summer camp book, but to a much wider range of topics and sources, and really kind of showing the proof in the pudding that you can write the history of a people from the perspective of young people, and that doing so doesn't just tell you how those young people lived, which is interesting and important in its own right, I think, but actually really tells you a lot about American Jewish culture. That's what I did in this book, and I want to do that now on a much broader scale.
Well, we are waiting with bated breath, I will say. So, just one last time, this is this incredible book. I'm sure your eyes will be drawn to it if you see it on a bookshelf. If you don't see it on a bookshelf, tell your local bookstore to put it in stock. If they
Yeah,
don't
lots
have
of
it at your
independent bookstores have it. So support independent.
board independent bookstores, bookshop.org. All of us need to quit Amazon. It is my great pleasure to have spent this hour with you, Sandy. Thank you so much for sharing your work. And as I say, for really taking my mind so far away from this present reality that I was using fire analogies by the end of our conversation.
Ay, ay, ay.
We're
Thank you,
so
Caroline. It
grateful
was
you could
great to
be
talk
here
to
with
you.
us today. And for everyone out there in Zoom land, thank you so much for enjoying this session. Please do check out all of our UCLA Levy Center events. There's an incredible array of wonderful speakers. Hopefully it'll bring some food for your soul in rough times. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.